Hello, and welcome to a special edition of Represent NYC. I'm Matthew McDermott. Dramatic, unprecedented, and unpredictable. That is the best way to describe the political landscape in America since Trump took office in 2016. It's been a bumpy ride. Well, fasten your seatbelts because we're 11 months out from Election Day, and it's only going to get worse. Chaos is going to be the new normal, and we're in for a wild ride until November 3rd. Joining me now to talk politics, predictions, and polls are Dr. Christina Greer, Associate Professor of Political Science at Fordham University, and political strategist Dr. Lincoln Mitchell. Thank you both for joining me today.
Thanks, Matt.
So let's speak about Trump before we begin with anything else. Polls a year out have him in not great but decent position heading into 2020. We have escalating tensions between the United States and Iran in a place that they haven't been in decades. We have an impeachment trial that ended late last year that led to the president being impeached by the U.S. House. Where does this leave Donald Trump heading into 2020? Christina?
Well, I think it depends on who the Democratic nominee will be. We know that lots of Democrats have said that if it's a hard-line progressive candidate, that they're not interested in voting or participating at all. So it really depends on what the matchup will be. We do know historically that Americans tend to turn out based on the economy and how they think they're doing personally. So if the economy still, sort of on paper at least, looks like it's doing well, and the president sort of shows this sign of strength that he's leading us through whatever international altercations we may find ourselves in closer to Election Day, then he's in a much better footing. Now, if we have a strong candidate that sort of unifies the Democratic Party, the economy is not as strong, and we're sort of internationally on the outs with our allies and our foes, and both, then I think that barring Russian intervention, which we know is still real, then I think the president has a lot to be worried about. Impeachment, unfortunately, is something that has been on the back burner thus far, just because we have so much other chaos going on in the White House in Washington, D.C.
I mean, Lincoln, let me ask you, I've talked to sort of a lot of pundits over the last few weeks, and they've consistently, to me at least, made the argument that for Democrats to break through in 2020, they have to find a policy argument to take to Trump, in part because of this chaos, because he has just this authentic chaos to his personality that allows him to take up the media waves like other people don't. I guess, one, do you agree with that? And two, if not, what is the message that Democrats need to be taking to Trump next year?
Well, there's a couple things that come to mind. I think pundits often say things because they think that's what pundits should say, or they think that's going to make them look smart, or they think that's going to get them on CNN. And one of those things is you have to talk about policy. Pundits, if you ask them about an election in a country they've never heard of, say, well, they're going to have to talk about policy, right? So that's one thing. Secondly, one way that pundits can seem clever is by saying, well, I think Trump's going to get reelected. Because if you say that to someone who's opposing Trump, then if Trump ends up not getting reelected, everyone's happy. And if Trump does, then they say, hey, you were smart, right? But this election is happening in an interesting context. There are two kind of conflicting macro data points. One is the economy, as Dr. Greer pointed out. If a normal Republican, to the extent that's not an oxymoron, but if a Marco Rubio, a John Kasich, somebody were running with this economy, they would win easily. On the other hand, Trump's polling numbers are stuck in the mid-40s. The latest poll from Michigan shows Biden beating him by 7 points and Warren and Sanders by about 4 points. Michigan is a key swing state that Trump surprised a lot of people by carrying in 2020. In 2016. He needs it in 2020. Similarly, on the foreign policy front, if Trump handles the Iran situation well going forward, which is, of course, no guarantee at all, there is a story he can tell. I killed al-Baghdadi, I fought ISIS, I killed Soleimani, I avoided foreign conflicts. But the problem with Trump in terms of the election is everything else, right? So American voters are looking around and they're saying, I don't love the racism, I don't love the bigotry, I don't love the criminality, I don't love the dishonesty, I don't love the sleaziness, I don't love constantly being verbally assaulted on Twitter and on the television by Donald Trump. So if you talk about policy, of course you don't run for president by not talking about policy. Everyone who's ever run for president has talked about policy, and a lot of them. But you have to also talk about the person of Trump, because Trump is a much stronger candidate if the conversation is restricted to policy.
Well, but I have to say, though, and I agree with what Lincoln has said wholeheartedly, but this is where the asterisk comes in. There are far too many Republicans and independent voters who say, I don't like the corruption. I don't like the bigotry. I don't like what's going on at the border. I don't. He is all of these negative things. However, but I'm still going to vote for him because my personal circumstances or the economy are doing well. And so they will ignore the racism, the ignorance, the bigotry, the xenophobia, the anti-Semitism, all of these things, and still say, but he's a good president. And that is the problem, because far too many people are willing to excuse all of these things for this one little thing that's called, the economy.
And that's the challenge, not the problem, right? But you make it a problem if you just ignore it. That's why you have to talk about it. But I would point out something else here, which, again, is something that pundits aren't supposed to say. Since Donald Trump won in 2016, there's been this kind of collective fetishization of the white working class, which voted marginally more for Donald Trump than every Republican candidate this century.
Right.
The truth about this coming election, and I'm not talking about public opinion data, I'm not talking about the economy versus the positions on guns or racism or anything like that. There's a basic truth here, which is that if every demographic trend from 2016 is repeated, Trump loses because of age replacement. Trump's voters, the voters who have shuffled off their mortal coils in the last 4 years skew very heavily towards Trump because his vote is so much older. Those in demographic terms who have matured, grown into being 18 years old and can now vote, skew much more Democratic just on demographics, not on some magic young people don't like Trump, but just on demographics. Age replacement is what makes this a complicated election for Trump. He has to win over people who voted for Clinton or demographic groups that voted over for Clinton. The Democrats, it'd be great if a Biden or a Warren or a Sanders could do that, could get some of these white working class voters back. But at the end of the day, and I know this is not something you say when you're trying to mobilize voters, but I'm not advocating here, I'm just giving you analysis. They don't actually have to do that.
But see, I think part of the issue that we struggle with is that demographics isn't always destiny, because we know that so many state houses understand this fact that the older white voters are aging out and you have this younger crop of a multifaceted voter base. And so in places like Georgia and Wisconsin and North Carolina, they are doing their level best to make sure that they take people off the scrolls, to make sure it's much more harder to register to vote, to have misinformation and disinformation. So people who want to participate still can't get into the electoral space because of voter suppression and essentially voter disenfranchisement in levels that we haven't seen in almost 100 years.
So we could have this conversation. One more.
This is a really important point that you made, because for the first 5 minutes here, we've been having a conversation as if 2020 is going to be a free, fair, and democratic election. And it's not. And every minute we spend not discussing that is really damaging. The other piece of this is that Trump has made it clear that he will not leave office if he loses. And when he is acquitted by the Senate for this impeachment issue, which he will be, and it'll be basically a party line vote, that is there in permission for him to do that. That is what really the picture that frames this 2020 election, more than can a few votes switch this way or that way.
So let's talk about that Democratic electorate in what I agree is a playing field right now that is not level, and look at the candidates that the Democrats have before them heading into Iowa, which is now just a few weeks away. And I want to get your perspectives on what has sort of transpired over the last few months, where the Democrats stand heading into Iowa, and who you see as, I will not say, the big Mo on television, I guess I just did, but who has the momentum heading into Iowa based on what you're seeing in your circles and on the ground in Iowa? And Christina, I'll start with you.
Well, I think it's really fascinating that you see candidates of color not being able to make it to Iowa, even though the Democratic Party is, clearly the most diverse party when compared to the Republican Party. And, that has to do with donations, that has to do with sort of the history of giving, that has to do with inequities in salaries across the nation when it comes to people of color versus whites. So I think that is where we start. And so we know the big four, right? If we come from safaris, it's like the big five, right? So we've got Warren, Buttigieg, Biden, and Sanders, who are clearly, sort of making inroads and representing, I think, two factions of the Democratic Party, either the progressive wing or the more moderate centrist wing, which is going to hopefully capture those weak-leaning Republicans and independents who, think that Trump's behavior is just a bit too much, but, they're willing to vote for a Democrat. Unfortunately, there are far too many Democrats who have said out loud that they just won't vote for Elizabeth Warren, no matter what. So this is a similar conversation that we had 3 years ago with Hillary Clinton, where there was an ire. Now, there was a history there, so people tried to justify it with, we've known her for 30 years. With Elizabeth Warren, it's a little different. They can't seem to give me a tangible reason why they won't vote for her. Yes, and I was like, something about those. I was like, is it her ovaries? I don't know what it is. But there's something about Elizabeth Warren that makes a lot of Democrats incredibly angry. And so it's not just those people who have said that they won't vote for her. It is now worrying certain Democrats who like Elizabeth Warren, who are afraid, well, if she's the nominee, then we're going to lose those sort of weak-leaning Democrats or those anti-Warren Democrats. And the goal of almost every Democrat right now is to make sure that Donald Trump does not get reelected. And so when we look at Iowa, you have people, making a calculus. Is Pete Buttigieg too young, or the fact that he has a husband and not a wife, is that going to change certain Democratic voters? So you have people basing their decision not just on their personal preferences, but on assumptions of what they think their friends and neighbors will do as well. That's going to actually make the February caucus quite fascinating. And keep in mind, it's a caucus and not a primary. So it's a very different way of electing someone, and it's not anonymous. And so I think that, this is one of the issues that Julian Castro brought up, where it's just, this is a type of politics that actually isn't necessarily democratic. Small d Democratic.
Let me ask you, because look, I'm a pollster for a living, and I've seen the data just like anyone else. And you look at the polling coming out of Iowa, and there's a pretty clear one-to-one transfer of votes, right now at least, in the final weeks between Biden and Buttigieg and Warren and Sanders. And if Sanders were to weaken at all, it looks like Warren would pick up a lot of that support, and vice versa. If Biden were to weaken at all, it looks like Pete would pick up a lot of that support. So I'm curious why we're sitting a few weeks before the caucus and none of the candidates have seemed to take that contrast message against the candidate that they're competing with votes against to actually win this caucus. Do you expect in this final debate heading into the caucus that we'll see more of a contrast between this sort of centrist wing of the party that has taken shape and the progressives, or do we anticipate sort of just, everyone going into the caucus with spirits high?
In a multi-candidate race, the problem with going on the attack is that you can move voters from the person you're attacking to somebody else. Now, when there is a front runner who is in danger of running away with the thing, somebody has to do that. In 2016, nobody did that on the Republican side, and that's why a major reason why Trump was able to win the nomination. In this election, if you're Pete Buttigieg, going after Biden is not going to help you. It may bring Biden down, but we know that a lot of Biden supporters are looking at Sanders as their number 2 choice. The only exception of this, I think, is the last debate where Amy Klobuchar went at Pete Buttigieg very hard. And the reason for that is that Buttigieg and Klobuchar, they either have to win Iowa or be bunched up so close that they've de facto won it, or else they don't have a future. So you see a little bit of that. On the other hand, we spoke about Warren. Warren has to beat Sanders in one of these first 2 states. This is a very interesting race because on the one hand, there's 150 candidates, and it's now down to 117 because some, I'm exaggerating, but some have dropped out. But it's also a very traditional Democratic race. There's the centrist, mainstream kind of guy that's got the backing of the establishment, the insider. Now, Bernie Sanders is an outsider only in the mind of himself and his supporters, but in that model he is more to the left. And it is very likely, or I wouldn't say likely, but certainly very possible that this becomes a 2-candidate race relatively quickly. If Bernie beats Warren in those first 2 states, she's done. If Biden beats Buttigieg in those first 2 states, he's done. And then there's Michael Bloomberg, who we haven't talked about. And we spoke about the challenges facing candidates of color. One thing, it doesn't help to do the first 2 primaries in entirely white states, and not entirely, but almost entirely white. And then Steyer has essentially bought his way onto the debate stage by investing money in Nevada, where he could get more bang for his buck and get some nice poll numbers. But this movement towards competitive oligarchy, right? Bloomberg is getting supporters from elected officials who just happen to have gotten big grants in their cities for him, right? That's not a healthy sign for democracy.
But I think also we have to remember inflated and deflated expectations, because if we remember 1992 with Bill Clinton running, he did not place well in Iowa.
Correct. Well, Harkin was in that race, so he couldn't.
So it's just, he was sort of written off until he came in second. You remember he did not win New Hampshire, but he came in second place, and it was like, well, wait a minute, who is this governor from Arkansas? And so then that gave him momentum in South Carolina. So I think you bringing up Klobuchar is a really fascinating point. She could come in 5th or so in Iowa, that's sort of the expectation. But if she comes in, say, third in Iowa, then all of a sudden she had deflated expectations, and now all of a sudden she's in a conversation that could give her some momentum that sort of keeps her in the conversation. But with Mike Bloomberg, the difference is between a Steyer and a Bloomberg is that Steyer was never an elected official. So he's essentially just a wealthy person who's bought himself onto a stage. With Mike Bloomberg, because he was the mayor of New York City, not the mayor of South Bend or Newark or Burlington, Vermont, we have multiple mayors in the race, of New York City for 12 years post 9/11. Yep. He's created fellowships for mayors across the country. We know that a lot of these mayors are constrained by their state houses, many of whom are Democratic mayors in Republican states, yep, and limited by the federal government. Michael Bloomberg presents a listening ear and an understanding of cities and constraints that leaders face in cities where, he's slowly but surely picking off progressive mayors across the South. He's picking off black mayors across the country just because he understands their needs and constraints. Also, as we must understand, we can never turn our backs on someone who has $52 billion and is 77 years old and is looking at this as essentially a last shot.
So, to the point about Mike Bloomberg, I wanted to ask a question. He's announced in the last few days that regardless of whether he wins or loses this race, he anticipates staying in the fray and spending significant amount of money, particularly on social media, to take the message to Donald Trump. That type of news would give me the belief that he's partially running a campaign for president right now, also partially running an opposition campaign against Donald Trump. Does that at all change the implications of having a Mike Bloomberg in the race?
I just want to hopefully correct something or add my thoughts to something you said, which is that he's not getting the support just because he understands those people and those mayors in those cities. He's getting the support because he understands them and because he's thrown a lot of money to their cities over the years. I'm not saying Michael Bloomberg hasn't done any good, right? It is rather odd, and of course with his wealth, that he looks around and says, there's a real problem out there and the best thing I could do is run for president. Bloomberg he is the most successful Republican chief executive of the 21st century. And if he really wanted to make a difference here, he would primary Donald Trump, because then he would get those rational Republicans who like the economy, who think Warren and even Biden are too far left, but care about guns, have kind of adult opinions about guns and about the environment. That's what conservative politicians look like in most countries. It is hard to imagine that looked around and said, with my $60 billion, the best thing I can do is run for president, right? He could have bought Fox News for a fraction of that money. That would have changed the dynamic here. I think that he is, because of who he is, and to get to your question, and because of his money, he has to be seen as committed to softening up Trump. Because if he's seen as the billionaire who might take his marbles and go home, or who might run a third-party candidacy, then that's all the questions he's going to get. That's going to dog him. And that would be, and when people write the final story about Michael Bloomberg, he doesn't want it to be. He's smart enough to know that he doesn't want it to be helped re-elect Trump, rather than, very successful mayor and entrepreneur and successful business person. He's got a shot. If this gets to be a 3 or more person race, coming out of the first 4, going into Super Tuesday, where that money really matters, where you're not doing retail politics, he's got a shot. The one kind of caveat I might add there is that the latest poll from California in the primary, which demographically looks different from other big states in ways that people who are from there don't always get, but one of them is the suburbs in California are heavily Latino. He is, that's why Orange County flipped. Right. Biden is running third. Warren and Sanders have between them about 70% of the vote locked up, or in this poll in California. That's going to be hard for Bloomberg to break into that. So he's got his work cut out for him.
Well, we also know that he has the money to hire people to figure it out, right? And everyone's saying,
has.
Yeah, and has. Because stop and frisk is one issue. It's an important issue, but it's just one. And so, everyone's like, how can he win without black women? It's like, listen, I don't think he will get 98% of black women. However, he knows that he doesn't need 98% of black women. He's figured out whatever that percentage is, and he knows that he can carve into that group. I think time is not on his side necessarily. However, when after Thanksgiving, when I asked my students how things were when they went home to Ohio and California and Nebraska, and all of them said, all we saw were Bloomberg ads on television all day, every day. And if New Yorkers remember 2001, when he decided not to participate in the Democratic primary, and that's why he ran as a Republican, he inundated New Yorkers with ads and literature every single day, where it sort of wears you down to a certain extent. And so my issue, though, with Michael Bloomberg is that he thinks that the government can be run like a business, similarly to Trump. Now, granted, he is a much better businessman than Trump. Granted, he is a legitimate billionaire, unlike the president. However, his soft skills and his retail politics are just something that he's never been interested in. And so it's fascinating to see him run a campaign where he's distanced himself from the voters and is just using television ads and literature to make this connection, but he doesn't actually want to do the sort of grip and grin that so many politicians are running around the country doing.
I think he's also, I mean, you see just in the money race, I think it's fascinating to me, someone put out in the last week or so that Democrats this year in this primary versus 2018 have essentially raised double what Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders raised in 2016. I think we're over 120 or 130 million dollars this year. So it's obvious that the 4 or maybe 5, if you count Amy Klobuchar, Democrats heading into Iowa have the money right now, at least, to compete, which seems to also sort of be altering the dynamics a little bit.
Notably, Bernie Sanders and Andrew Yang combined to raise more money in the fourth quarter than Donald Trump, which is quite something.
Yeah.
I don't know that any of these candidates, outside of maybe Bernie, have the money to compete after the first 4 states. And that's what Bloomberg is counting on. There's this real knockdown, drag-out 4 states, Iowa, New Hampshire, Nevada, South Carolina. Even those who survive that, and it might be 3, might be 1, might be 5, are low on cash, and they've got to just kind of, and they're getting calls. There's all these states coming up. You've got to be in Massachusetts. No, you got to be in California. And Bloomberg just got the ads up and running. That will get him into contention. The problem he faces is that at least 2 of these candidates, and perhaps 3, certainly Biden, because of just how long he's been around, vice president for 8 years, he has tens of millions of dollars of name recognition because of who he is. Bernie, because he's been running for president for 5 years, has that too, and Warren has close to that.
Right.
If he were running against a bunch of senators, Michael Bennet, John Hickenlooper, yeah, he could run the table. This is going to be a lot tougher. And the other challenge for Bloomberg, as we know, is that his appeal resonates so well with kind of the upper middle class, the people that write book reviews, the people who are pundits, that they think it's bigger than it is. This kind of liberal socially, conservative politically, pretty conservative on racial politics, although polite and well-dressed about it, there's not as big a constituency for that as there is for the reverse, which is Trump, right? So I don't know where Bloomberg gets his votes in a primary. In a general, of course, he'd have a very good shot against Trump.
Let's talk a little bit about sort of what I would describe as the gatekeepers of the party right now, particularly since we have such a diverse field still heading into the early states. I think we've seen in the last few days Eric Garcetti come out and endorse Joe Biden. In the last few days, we saw Julian Castro come out and endorse Elizabeth Warren. Should we anticipate any of the other Democrats that have now left this field, I think Senator Kamala Harris being the obvious one, to make a decision in this race and endorse either before Iowa or once this field sort of nets out to 2 or maybe 3 candidates?
Well, I mean, endorsements matter and they don't, in the sense that they're a signal to particular voters as to what a leader they may like is thinking. But I think so many people, we sort of have 2 groups. They either have a candidate who they love, and they're super committed, and they have a second choice candidate, or they have no candidate at all. And I think that's far too many Democrats right now, where the field is so wide, and when you ask Democrats, like, who are you interested in? Like, I don't really know. And so unfortunately, the baseline is someone who can beat Trump, but something about the multitude of candidates isn't necessarily connecting with Democratic voters on a wide scale. We also have to remember there's so many Democratic voters who are not paying attention. We have been talking about this for a year.
For far too long.
Right, for way too long. But when you ask people who aren't in this business, they're not paying attention just yet. They might pay attention when the primary comes to their state. They may not. I mean, we know that voter turnout in this country is embarrassingly low. And so, granted, this election is, as we say, every 4 years, the most important election of our American democracy. But we know that a lot of Americans actually just aren't paying attention. So a Garcetti endorsement to Biden may signal something to Latinx voters. It may signal something to Democratic voters who live in cities or who live in Los Angeles specifically. But I don't think that it's going to significantly turn the tide. And then just the last little piece about Bloomberg. We have to remember he made his money off of the media. So it's not like he, is a billionaire because he made shoes. I mean, he understands the media, and so we can't discount that when it comes to the optics of endorsements or no endorsements at all.
And I guess that, Lincoln, to you, I'm sort of interested in the idea of endorsements because I agree, Christina. I mean, it seems to me like there's huge enthusiasm in this electorate, right? I mean, I think everyone anticipates that the Iowa caucuses will have a record turnout this year, and yet these voters don't seem to be lining up behind any one candidate. There's a tension there between the enthusiasm that exists and the inability in part to put that enthusiasm behind a unified candidate. And so I guess I'm curious your perspective, Lincoln, of sort of what changes in that dynamic. Is it that gatekeepers are going to come in and say, all right, we've had a great primary for a year, now it's time to focus our attention on November? Or is it just that people are going to quite literally run out of money and we're going to rally behind whoever's left standing?
Well, many candidates will run out of money, not all of them. The thing about endorses is, a candidate or a mayor like Eric Garcetti, popular mayor in LA, but if a Latino assembly person endorses Sanders, that he's going to work or she's going to work her district to get the, so there's going to be competing endorsements. If everybody lines up, or if all the progressives in California or Massachusetts line up with someone, that's different. The other thing about endorsements is it depends how you use them. So AOC's endorsement of Sanders was not just good for Bernie Sanders' campaign, but he has used it very well. So that's part of it.
Also, I mean, to his credit, or to the reality, he also used it as an inflection point after having a heart attack.
Right. So he really got a lot out of that. I think to your question, there is a concern in the Democratic Party that they don't want to be seen as pushing, and there is no the Democratic Party, right? There's a bunch of people, right? There's a bunch of state, of county chairs and deputy. There's Tom Perez isn't huddling with Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer and saying, who are we going to nominate, right? That's not how the party works. But there's a hesitancy among the leadership to be seen as lining up behind somebody and quieting voices that may be more progressive, that may be younger, that may be less white. So they need this process to play out. My sense is that it will play out in a way that automatically narrows the field. I really expect this to be, at most, and I'm counting Bloomberg in this, 5 real candidates and probably more like 3 going into Super Tuesday, which is only March 3rd. And then you have a process. And then the challenge is to make that process such that nobody takes their toys and goes home afterwards. That's the bigger challenge. My view is that the one thing we all care about electability. Democrats care about that. The one thing we know for sure about electability is that we don't know anything about electability. So the challenge here is not to figure out, is it Bernie, is it Warren, is it Biden, is it Buttigieg, is it Klobuchar, but to make sure that whoever it is, the party gets behind that person 100% as unified as possible. That's more important for the electability question than who the actual nominee is.
All right, well, I will leave it at that. That is all the time we have today. Christina and Lincoln, thank you so much for joining me today. And thank you all for watching this special edition of Represent NYC on Manhattan Neighborhood Network. I'm Matthew McDermott. Goodbye.